result of God's conatus of creating the best, limited to its degree of perception and repetition and so on. But I don't know if I can say anything else about it. Yeah.
Yep. Bob Adams, University of North Carolina. My question definitely falls outside the bounds of either of your papers, for which I thank you. Very, very interesting papers. But I'm wondering whether either of your researches has led to some sort of answer to a question about which I'm curious, which is how, by what steps or arguments, in what incidents and so forth, so much of German Lutheranism migrated from Luther's De Servo Arbitrio to the incompatibilist libertarianism that led Crusius and so many pietists in the first half of the 18th century, as Ursula remarked, to reject aspects of the philosophy of Leibniz and Wolff.
So, well, I think that Lutheran theological tradition evolved so much from the Servo Arbitrio for many reasons, and in some way we find in the controversy that I try to explain, we find that Lutheran theologians are more on the part of a sort of libertarian account, because well, they have much influence from scholastic, Jesuit scholastics, you know, Molina and Suarez, and in some way, when Lutherans says that God's election is founded in for knowledge of faith, they are endorsing a very not a hard position, not an Agustinian position on predestination, but a very acceptable one in some way. And I think that Leibniz feels comfortable within that sort of account to some extent, because he has a Molinist, very strong Molinist influence, although he rejects indeterminism and scientia media and that kind of thing. And I think that Leibniz evolves from a more Calvinist approach in his early years to a more maybe Lutheran, if you understand Lutheran, by the contemporary context of his thought.
Thank you for a great question. I definitely agree that that is the case, but I wouldn't reduce it to Luther or the influence of Lutheranism. I certainly think that is the same in England with the influence of Calvinism, and in the Netherlands for sure. And I think that even the development of empiricism or the emphasis on empiristic philosophy goes well together with that kind of voluntarist and rather anti-rational approach. As you can see, the pietists in Germany at Halle, they read John Locke, who was exactly, you know, to their liking, already in the end of the 17th century, right after the publication of the new essay of the inquiry. So I definitely think that these theological questions are related to strictly metaphysical questions and decisions, right? And so Leibniz definitely, as well as Christian Wolff, came both from, they both had faced Catholic positions pretty early in their life. So they were much more open to this more rational theology of Catholic positions. So, and that was much more in agreement in a way with modern science, right, with this approach. So that is why we find so much Catholic, you know, or references or interest of Leibniz to find arguments to back his position. But what I definitely would say, and I'm very grateful to Agustín that he emphasized that so much, even when he picks up on this terminology of antecedent and consequential will in God, it's not exactly what they had thought it should be, right? He just uses the terminology to address the problem in the familiar language of theologians, which he had developed long before, almost since the Confessio. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm George Mavrodis from University of Michigan, and this is for Professor Echavarria. I'm going to read the last sentence of your paper. I think it's the last sentence, where you say, one may ask whether this neglected feature is essential or not for a successful defense of God's justice and for exonerating him of being the ultimate source of sin and damnation. But that question is out of the scope of this paper. Now, I want to suggest that maybe within the context of this conference, we may wonder whether this question is of any importance, whether the question would be of importance to somebody like Leibniz or to somebody operating within the context of a Leibnizian scheme. It seems to me that, as I understand it from the discussions we've had so far and what little reading I've done on myself on Leibniz, that the Leibnizian view of God, on the Leibnizian view, God is something like a super utilitarian. God's project is maximizing the good. So God is presented with a catalog of possible worlds, and the possible worlds have various values. God is able to determine what the values of these worlds are, and his project is to pick out the best one and get that possible world into existence. Now, the list of possible worlds is not within God's power. God cannot produce a new possible world to add to this list by taking a piece of one possible world and patching it onto the piece of another possible world and so forth. To add to the list of possible worlds, he has to take possible worlds out of this list of possible worlds. And many of the possible worlds, of course, will include divine actions in the world. In fact, if this actual world is presumably one of the possible worlds, and if the gospel accounts and the biblical accounts and so forth, that some of us believe anyway, are correct or true, then there have been divine actions in this world, and so also in many other possible worlds. Now, suppose it were to turn out that in the best possible world, God does some injustices. So we cannot, in truth, defend God from the charge of injustice because he, in fact, does some injustices. Or perhaps there are some other ways in which God becomes the author of sin. Suppose there is some sin of which God really is the author. He really did get this guy to do the sin. Well, of course, those are bad features of the world, but Leibniz, it seems to me, is content and comfortable with thinking, well, the world has lots of bad things in it. It's not that the world doesn't have any bad things in it. Of course, it has the Lisbon earthquake, it has this, that, and the other pains and so forth, but it's the whole package which is the best. This is the best package, even including the bad things in it. Why would that not be satisfactory to Leibniz and be unconcerned with the claim, with exonerating himself from the charge of injustice? God would be unconcerned with exonerating himself from the charge of injustice in the world or of being the author of sin.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that indeed this is a goal that Leibniz tries to reach in his Theodicy, to exonerate God of being the author of sin and damnation. Perhaps the picture you presented is, well, it can be attributed to the earlier Leibniz. If you read a letter to Magnus Vederkopf on the omnipotence, earlier writings, Leibniz in some way rejects the concept of permission itself. and it holds a very utilitarian account for the problem of evil. But he evolves too much from this earlier stage to the Theodicy, and he tries to make place within his account to more, well, in some way, to a sort of free will defense. That is not the ultimate reason for permission of evil in Leibniz, but has some place within his system. And I think that the paper of Schmalz showed quite well the preoccupation of Leibniz of distinguishing between wanting evils and permitting evils. And I think that this is a constant preoccupation in Leibniz's career that has many steps. But I think that, well, that is the case, that it is important for Leibniz to exonerate God and for not being the author of sin, although he is, well, I don't know if he really succeeds. I think perhaps not setting aside a completely utilitarian or consequentialist account of the problem of evil. I think that ultimately that's his view, but he tries to make place within that picture some place to a sort of free will strategy.
I'm Brian Pitts from Notre Dame. I enjoyed the paper. I was brought up as a physicist before doing philosophy, and I'd like to address the claim that mechanics posed a difficulty for human agency, or special divine agency for that matter. It's worth recalling that in the 13th century, Aristotle's philosophy didn't fit with Christianity either regarding, say, the eternity of the world, which had roots in Aristotle's physics. The lesson, it seems to me, in physics is any plausible physical theory is not going naturally to have room for human or special divine agency, but if you want it, it's always easy to bore a hole and put it there. The only interesting objections must be a posteriori and empirical. So if you look at the brain and you don't find the soul acting, then that's a good argument, for example. But results of that sort were not very easy to come by in 1700, so I think it would be more of a wish list, a sort of a scientific wish list or promissory note than any sort of results that would have motivated Hobbes, or Leibniz, or Wolff on these issues.
Wow.
Comment?
You know, the question is just the brain is not what Leibniz understands by the mind. So that would still be a problem how the mind can influence the brain or the body, etc. So,
well, one would need to show there's some sort of difficulty before there needed to be an answer, and the initial showing of the difficulty is what hasn't been done, seems to me.
The initial shows the difficulty. I didn't get. Can you say it again?
I mean, the thought that you expressed, I assume, was, you know, Leibniz was understanding physics better than perhaps than Descartes was, for example. I mean, Descartes seemed to think that he had room for the soul to act.
Can you go to the
Leibniz wants to move away from that in favor of pre-established harmony.
Yeah.
Okay. So Leibniz thinks that he has some sort of scientific reason for pre-established harmony as opposed to Descartes' interactionism, for example. But I think that would be maybe appealing to scientific results you'd like to have someday. It's certainly not appealing to any interesting a posteriori empirical results available in 1700, and those would be the only ones that ought to be convincing.
I'm not sure if I got the message. You know, what Leibniz would just say, he has a nice story to tell, even if he can explain everything, how our brain works, etc., by empirical research, and could go within our brain like in a mill. You know, we could see all the wheels, how it works, and how the synapses connect, whatever else. But then it is still not yet a thought. That is just kind of bodily motion, right? And so how the body ever can have an influence on a thought, that is still something which has to be explained in a different way than just by an influxus physicus.
Yeah, yes, but your point seemed to be Leibniz thought he had scientific reasons